What if one of America's greatest strategic failures in the Middle East was not a single war, a single president, or a single policy, but a pattern of mistakes repeated over decades? What if the real story of U.S. policy toward Iran is not just about hostility, sanctions, and threats, but about 5 brutal miscalculations that helped turn a difficult rival into one of Washington's most stubborn and dangerous geopolitical problems? Because when Americans think about Iran, many think first of the hostage crisis, anti-American chants, nuclear fears, proxy militias, and a regime that has spent decades defining itself in opposition to the United States. But history becomes far more uncomfortable when you ask a harder question. How many of Iran's advantages were strengthened, not despite American policy, but because of it? How many times did Washington act with confidence, only to discover later that it had made Iran more influential, more suspicious, more entrenched, or simply harder to contain? That is what makes this subject so important. Great nations do not become stronger by ignoring their strategic errors. They become stronger by studying them honestly. So if you believe patriotism is not blind pride, but the courage to understand what helps America win and what causes America to stumble, like this video and subscribe to American History Animated. On this channel, we do more than revisit the past. We break down the decisions, misjudgments, and turning points that still shape America's place in the world today. And tonight, we are diving into 5 brutal strategic mistakes the U.S. made against Iran. Some of these mistakes were made in anger. Some were made in arrogance. Some were made with good intentions but terrible consequences. And all of them helped shape the rivalry we know today. Before we begin, here is the big question I want you to keep in mind. Was America's biggest mistake with Iran being too weak, too aggressive, or simply too short-sighted? Hold on to that question, because halfway through this video, I want your answer in the comments. First brutal strategic mistake was helping destroy the legitimacy of Iran's democratic path while tying America too closely to the Shah. For many Americans, Iran's anti-US revolution in 1979 seemed to come out of nowhere, like an irrational explosion of hatred. But from the Iranian perspective, the story looked very different. Washington had backed a political order that many Iranians came to see as authoritarian, externally supported, and disconnected from national dignity. That meant when the monarchy fell, anger did not stop with the Shah. It flowed directly toward the United States. In strategic terms, this was disastrous. America did not simply lose an ally. It helped create the emotional and political conditions for a revolutionary regime that would define itself against American influence for generations. The second mistake was allowing the hostage crisis to harden into the permanent emotional foundation of U.S.-Iran relations. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran was a humiliation, and it shocked the United States before the entire world. But the strategic failure came afterward. Instead of treating the crisis as a horrible rupture that needed to be contained and eventually politically outgrown, both sides allowed it to become a defining symbol. In America, Iran became not just an adversary, but a national wound. In Iran, defiance of the United States became part of revolutionary legitimacy. That meant diplomacy would never again be judged only on practical results. It would also be judged through memory, symbolism, pride, and humiliation. Once that happened, every future peace effort became harder. The crisis ended. The emotional architecture of the rivalry did not. The third mistake was helping empower Iran through the Iraq War. This was one of the most extraordinary strategic ironies in modern American foreign policy. The United States removed Saddam Hussein, one of Iran's most dangerous regional enemies, and in doing so opened the way for Tehran to expand its influence westward. Instead of isolating Iran, Washington helped reshape the regional balance in a way that gave Iran greater room to maneuver in Iraq and beyond. That does not mean American leaders wanted that result. But strategy is judged by outcomes, not intentions. And the outcome was that a war launched in the name of American security ended up strengthening the position of a major U.S. rival. Few mistakes are more brutal than spending blood, treasure, and credibility only to make your adversary more strategically comfortable. And here is where I want your answer in the comments. Which was worse for the United States, empowering Iran by removing Saddam, or deepening the rivalry by turning every crisis into a symbol of national humiliation? I want your honest answer, because this is the point where history stops being abstract and becomes a real debate about American power. The fourth mistake was repeatedly mishandling moments when diplomacy might have reduced tension. This does not mean Iran was suddenly trustworthy. It does not mean every opening was sincere, but it does mean Washington too often struggled to decide whether it wanted behavior change, regime pressure, symbolic toughness, or an actual strategic settlement. After the attacks of September 11th, there were moments when U.S. and Iranian interests overlapped against the Taliban. There were also later signals, direct and indirect, suggesting broader talks might be possible. Yet these openings never matured into a durable change in relations. Why? Because ideology, mistrust, domestic politics, and strategic confusion crushed them. America sometimes seemed unwilling to test diplomacy seriously when leverage existed. At other times, it entered diplomacy without building long-term political protection for the results. In either case, the effect was the same. Opportunities appeared, then vanished, leaving both sides even more suspicious than before. The fifth mistake was assuming pressure alone could achieve what strategy had not clearly defined. Few examples capture this better than the collapse of the nuclear deal era. The 2015 agreement was not friendship. It was not peace. It did not end proxy warfare, missile tensions, or ideological hostility. But it did create a structured framework of limits, inspections, and communication. When the United States withdrew without replacing that structure with something more effective, it did not simply end a policy. It weakened a mechanism that had imposed constraints while proving to Tehran that American commitments could be reversed by domestic political change. That mattered enormously. Because if your rival concludes that negotiation brings only temporary relief while pressure is permanent, then the incentive to compromise shrinks. Maximum pressure sounded strong, but without a credible path to a more stable end state, it risked becoming pressure without strategic closure. What makes these 5 mistakes so important is that none of them happened in a vacuum. They reinforced each other. America tied itself too closely to a discredited order. Then it allowed humiliation to define the relationship. Then it removed a regional barrier that had constrained Iranian power. Then it failed to lock in diplomatic openings. Then it dismantled one of the few structured agreements that had at least slowed escalation. Step by step, Washington helped build the very environment in which Iran learned to survive through asymmetry, proxies, hardened distrust, and long-term strategic patience. And this is where the story becomes even more uncomfortable for Americans. Iran's leaders did not need to defeat the United States militarily to gain leverage. They only needed to understand American weaknesses well enough to raise the cost of American action. They learned that U.S. policy could swing between force and negotiation, between patience and fury, between long-term goals and short-term politics. They learned that time itself could be a weapon. They learned that America's greatest strength, its global reach, could also become a burden if Washington entered conflicts without a disciplined endgame. In other words, some of Iran's most useful strategic lessons came from watching American mistakes unfold in real time. That does not mean the blame for this rivalry belongs only to Washington. Iran's regime made its own aggressive choices. It invested in anti-American ideology, proxy warfare, repression, escalation, and nuclear brinkmanship. But serious history is not about assigning all guilt to one side. It is about understanding how rivalries harden, why misjudgments repeat themselves, and how power can be wasted even by nations with enormous advantages. America was stronger than Iran on paper, but strategy is not a contest on paper. It is a contest of decisions, timing, credibility, and consequences. So when we look back at the 5 brutal strategic mistakes the US made against Iran, we are really looking at something bigger than one bilateral rivalry. We are looking at a warning about how great powers lose clarity. They mistake tactical victories for strategic gains. They confuse pressure with progress. They let domestic politics weaken diplomatic continuity, and they sometimes fail to realize that punishing an adversary is not the same thing as shaping a better long-term outcome. For Americans, that lesson matters deeply. The United States is still the most powerful nation on Earth, but power without strategic discipline can still produce outcomes that benefit rivals. If America wants to remain strong, respected, and secure, it has to do more than react. It has to think farther ahead than its enemies do. It has to understand that patriotism is not just about cheering strength. It is about learning from error so the country becomes harder to outmaneuver in the future. So if this video made you think more seriously about how American power should be used and how America can avoid repeating costly mistakes, like this video and subscribe to American History Animated. If you believe informed citizens make a stronger republic and that understanding hard history is part of protecting America's future, then this channel is for you. And before you go, leave your final answer in the comments. Which of these 5 mistakes caused the most long-term damage to the United States? And do you think America's biggest problem with Iran was bad strategy, bad timing, or the inability to commit to a clear long-term goal? That answer says a lot about how you see power, patriotism, and America's role in the world.